The weight of the gavel. The sun had long set over the city by the time Judge Yvonne Williams turned the key in her car's ignition. Her chambers had been unusually quiet as she wrapped up the last of her paperwork, but her mind was anything but still. Every decision she made in the courtroom reverberated far beyond the walls of the courthouse. As one of the few black female judges in the state, Yvonne bore the dual responsibility of upholding the law while quietly dismantling the prejudices woven into its fabric. Tonight was no exception. Her last case of the day, a young man of color accused of a crime with questionable evidence, lingered in her thoughts. The echoes of the defendant's trembling voice pleading his innocence haunted her as she navigated the city streets. How often, she mused, gripping the steering wheel tighter, are we judged not by our actions but by the color of our skin? Yvonne's success story was the kind people admired from afar but rarely understood. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood where resources were scarce, but ambition ran high. Her mother, a schoolteacher with a fiery sense of justice, had instilled in her the belief that education could be a path to liberation. It was her mother's sacrifices, working double shifts, tutoring children in the evenings, that had lit a fire in Yvonne's heart. That fire had propelled her through law school, into the courtroom as a defense attorney, and finally to the bench. But the climb had been steep, riddled with obstacles. In a system dominated by men who often dismissed her intellect and a society that doubted her capabilities before she even spoke, Yvonne had learned to make her presence undeniable. Her car glided through a quiet residential street, the warm glow of porch lights casting long shadows across the asphalt. She allowed herself a moment of peace, her thoughts drifting to her late mother's words, "Never let them define you. Define yourself." But just as quickly as serenity had found her, it was shattered. The harsh glare of red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror, piercing through the calm night like a predator's gaze. Yvonne felt her chest tighten, her breath caught somewhere between indignation and dread. She hadn't been speeding. Her car registration and insurance were up to date. There was no reason, none, that this stop should be happening. Not tonight, she whispered under her breath, the words trembling as if spoken to the universe itself. But the universe had other plans. Pulling to the side of the road, Yvonne put the car in park and rolled her window down, her heart pounding as she reached for her license and registration. She could already see the silhouette of the officer in her side mirror, his posture tall and rigid as he approached her vehicle. The sight was unnerving, not because of what she had done nothing wrong, but because of what he might see in her. Not a judge, not a professional, but a black woman alone on an empty street. The officer stopped just short of her window, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. "License and registration," he said brusquely, not bothering with a greeting. "Yes, officer," Yvonne replied, handing over the documents she had retrieved moments earlier. She met his eyes briefly, but there was no warmth in them, only suspicion. "You know why I stopped you?" "No," Yvonne answered, keeping her voice steady despite the tremor rising in her chest. "I wasn't aware I'd done anything wrong." The officer clicked his tongue and studied her paperwork with a slow deliberation that felt less about procedure and more about power. "We received a report," he finally said, his tone sharp, "about a car matching this description involved in a robbery earlier tonight." Yvonne froze. "A robbery?" "That's right." His lips curled into a thin smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're going to need to step out of the vehicle." "Excuse me?" Yvonne's voice sharpened. "Officer, I'm Judge Yvonne Williams. I just left the courthouse less than an hour ago. I can assure you, I've been nowhere near any robbery." The officer's gaze flicked to the ID card clipped to her dashboard. For a brief moment, something akin to recognition flashed across his face, but it quickly gave way to something uglier, defiance, maybe even contempt. "Judge, huh?" he sneered. "Well, Judge Williams, you're going to have to come with me until we sort this out. Step out of the car." "This is a mistake," Yvonne said firmly, refusing to unbuckle her seatbelt. "I've done nothing wrong," and unless you have concrete evidence tying me to this so-called robbery, I'm not going anywhere. The officer's jaw tightened, and his hand moved toward his holster. Are you resisting? Yvonne's breath caught in her throat. She knew this script. She had read it in case files, seen it play out in courtroom testimonies, and witnessed its devastating consequences for those who looked like her. Her fingers trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, forcing herself to remain composed. I am not resisting, she said, her voice calm but firm. I am asserting my rights. And unless you have probable cause, you cannot detain me. Her words seemed to agitate him further. Lady, you can argue the law all you want back in your courtroom. Out here, I'm in charge. Now step out of the car. Yvonne's mind raced. She thought of her mother, of the values she had instilled in her, of the countless young women of color who looked up to her as a symbol of possibility. Would they see her defiance as courage, or as recklessness? Fine, she said, her voice steady. But this won't end well for you. As she stepped out of the car, the officer yanked her arm roughly, twisting it behind her back as he snapped cold metal cuffs onto her wrists. She winced, not from the physical pain but from the humiliation that burned hotter than any wound. You're making a mistake, she said through gritted teeth as he led her to his squad car. No, Judge, he replied with a smirk. You are. The ride to the station was a blur, the city lights outside the window smearing into streaks of color that felt disorienting. Yvonne kept her chin high, determined not to let the weight of the cuffs or the stares of the officers in the station break her resolve. But inside, a storm raged. How had her night descended into this nightmare? How had her years of service, her dedication to justice, her position as one of the state's most respected judges, been reduced to this? As she was shoved into a cold metal chair in a dimly lit interrogation room, Yvonne vowed silently, this wouldn't be the end of her story. She wouldn't let a system that had tried to silence her since birth have the last word. This wasn't just her fight. It was for every person who had ever been judged unfairly, every black man and woman who had ever felt the suffocating grip of systemic prejudice. And if this night was to become a defining moment, then she would make sure it defined her on her terms. The weight of the gavel was heavy, but Yvonne Williams had carried heavier. Fractures in the system. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into Yvonne's wrists as she sat in the dimly lit interrogation room. The silence in the small space felt oppressive, each second stretching into an eternity. The officer who had brought her in had left without a word, and she was now alone with her thoughts. The hum of the fluorescent light above her seemed almost deafening in the stillness. Yvonne was no stranger to the stories of wrongful arrests. She had seen them time and again in her courtroom, innocent individuals caught in the crossfire of prejudice and procedural failures. But now, sitting on the other side of justice, the reality felt far more harrowing than she could have imagined. The law she had dedicated her life to serving suddenly felt distant and unrecognizable. Her mind raced back to her last moments of freedom, the officer's tone, his sneer, and the unspoken hostility in his actions. She replayed the interaction in her head, analyzing every word, every movement. Could she have done something differently to avoid this? But the answer, she knew, was no. This wasn't about her actions, it was about assumptions. The door creaked open, jolting her from her thoughts. A man stepped in, his crisp navy suit contrasting sharply with the drab walls of the room. He carried a clipboard in one hand, his other hand casually tucked into his pocket. His badge glinted under the fluorescent light. Judge Williams, he began, his voice measured and professional. He sat across from her, placing the clipboard on the table between them. I'm Detective Harris. I'd like to ask you a few questions. Yvonne raised an eyebrow. I'd like to call my attorney, she replied coolly. Detective Harris leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. You're not under arrest, Judge. This is just an interview to clarify some things. You're free to leave whenever you like. Free to leave. Yvonne's voice dripped with incredulity as she lifted her cuffed wrists. This doesn't exactly scream freedom. Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. Look, there's been a report of a vehicle matching yours at the scene of a robbery. The officer who brought you in was acting on that report. Let's just clear this up, and you can be on your way. Yvonne narrowed her eyes. Clear this up. You dragged me in here, humiliated me, and handcuffed me in front of a precinct full of officers without so much as a shred of evidence. Now you want to clear this up. Do you have any idea who I am? I do, Harris said evenly. That's precisely why I'm handling this personally. Let's go through the events of your evening. Where were you between 7 o'clock and 8 p.m.? Yvonne took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain composed. As I told the officer, I was in my chambers at the courthouse, finishing up paperwork. I left around 8:15. There are security cameras in the building and in the parking lot. You're welcome to check the footage. Harris scribbled something on his clipboard before nodding. We'll verify that. And your car, has anyone else had access to it recently? No, Yvonne said firmly. It's registered to me, and I've had no reason to loan it out. Harris paused, his pen hovering over the clipboard. Judge, I'm trying to help here. The faster we can establish a timeline, the faster we can clear you. Yvonne leaned forward, her gaze piercing. Detective, let me be very clear. I don't need your help. What I need is for this department to recognize the blatant misconduct in how this situation was handled. Your officer profiled me, detained me without probable cause, and brought me here without allowing me to contact counsel. That's a violation of my rights. And if you think I'm going to let this slide, you don't know me at all. Harris held her gaze, his expression unreadable. You're right, he admitted after a long pause. This should have been handled differently. I'll personally make sure this is resolved as quickly as possible. Before Yvonne could respond, the door opened again, and the officer who had arrested her stepped inside. His posture was less confident now, his eyes darting nervously between Yvonne and Harris. Detective, he began, his voice unsure, we've got a call from dispatch. Another unit just brought in the actual suspect, a guy driving a stolen car that matches the judge's. Looks like a mix-up. Yvonne's eyes narrowed as she watched the color drain from the officer's face. A mix-up, she repeated, her voice icy. You humiliate me, violate my rights, and drag me here, and now it's a mix-up. The officer opened his mouth to respond, but Harris cut him off. Uncuff her, he ordered. The officer fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking as he removed the cuffs from Yvonne's wrists. The moment her hands were free, she stood, her height and presence commanding the room. I'll be filing a formal complaint, she said, her voice steady and full of resolve. And trust me when I say this incident won't disappear quietly. People need to know what happens when justice is weaponized against the very people it's supposed to protect. Harris nodded, his face grim. Understood, Judge. And for what it's worth, I am truly sorry. But his apology felt hollow in the face of what had just transpired. Yvonne turned on her heel and walked out of the room, her steps measured but purposeful. As she stepped out into the cool night air, her heart was heavy with the weight of what had just happened. She wasn't just a victim of an individual officer's prejudice, she was a casualty of a system designed to see her as less than, no matter her accomplishments or position. But this wasn't the end of the story. Yvonne knew that her power lay not just in her position as a judge but in her ability to shine a light on the dark corners of the system. Tonight had lit a fire in her, a fire that would burn until real change was achieved. For too long, justice had been blind in all the wrong ways. And if no one else was willing to hold the system accountable, Yvonne Williams would. A new order of justice. Yvonne stared out the window of her home office, the city lights casting a faint glow against the darkened sky. The mug of chamomile tea in her hands had long since gone cold. She hadn't slept much since the night of her arrest. Instead, her mind churned with plans, strategies, and questions. How had the system she had sworn to uphold failed so profoundly? And what would it take to ensure it didn't happen again, to her or anyone else? The emails and messages that poured in after the incident were both heartening and disheartening. Colleagues, friends, and strangers expressed outrage, sympathy, and solidarity. Many shared their own stories of systemic injustice, detailing arrests, accusations, and mistreatment based on little more than prejudice. The stories hit harder than they ever had before. She'd heard them from the bench, seen them in legal briefs, but now they were personal. She was no longer an observer of injustice, she was a survivor of it. Sitting at her desk, Yvonne opened her laptop and pulled up the draft of an op-ed she'd been working on. She had spent hours crafting the words, each sentence a deliberate strike against the systemic flaws that had allowed her ordeal to happen. Justice must be impartial, yet it remains blinded by prejudice. I, a sitting judge, was detained without cause, proof that the scales of justice tip unevenly for those the system deems suspect based on nothing more than appearance. My story is not unique, but it is a call to action. We cannot continue to allow these fractures in our legal system to persist. We must rebuild it from its very foundation. Yvonne leaned back in her chair, reading the words again. They felt true, but words alone wouldn't be enough. She needed more than outrage, she needed to build a movement. The next morning, Yvonne was sitting in a conference room filled with her closest allies, civil rights attorneys, community leaders, and activists. The air buzzed with the energy of a group united by a common goal. We have an opportunity here, Yvonne began, her voice steady but impassioned. What happened to me is just one example of a larger problem. But the attention this has brought gives us a platform to push for real reform. We can't let this moment slip away. A woman in the back raised her hand. Judge Williams, the media coverage has been overwhelming. People are angry, yes, but how do we turn that anger into actionable change? Protests and articles only go so far. Yvonne nodded. You're right. That's why I'm proposing we take a multi-pronged approach. Public awareness is step one, but we need policy change. We need data to back up our demands. And we need to create systems of accountability, both within law enforcement and within the courts. Another voice chimed in, this time a young man with a background in grassroots organizing. We should start with a coalition. Bring together organizations already working on these issues, police reform, racial justice, judicial accountability. We amplify their efforts and add our own momentum. That's exactly the idea, Yvonne said, feeling a spark of hope. But we can't just focus on the symptoms. We need to address the root causes. Training is important, but so are structural changes, independent oversight committees, body camera mandates, and ending practices like qualified immunity. The group spent hours strategizing, sketching out plans, assigning roles. By the end of the day, they had the framework for a new organization, the Justice Alliance, dedicated to fighting systemic bias and advocating for reforms at every level of the legal system. In the weeks that followed, Yvonne became the face of the movement, her story galvanizing supporters across the country. She appeared on national television, not as a victim, but as a leader demanding accountability. She met with lawmakers, pushing for legislation to address the systemic failures that allowed incidents like hers to occur. At the same time, she didn't abandon her role on the bench. Each case she presided over became an opportunity to apply her newfound understanding of the system's flaws. She advocated for fairer sentencing, scrutinized evidence with greater care, and ensured that every defendant who appeared before her felt seen and heard. One morning, months after the incident, Yvonne walked into her courtroom to find it packed, not with reporters or curious onlookers, but with ordinary citizens who had come to watch justice in action. They wanted to see the judge who had taken her own struggle and turned it into a crusade for change. As she took her seat at the bench, Yvonne looked out at the faces in the crowd. They were diverse, young and old, black and white, hopeful and wary. Each one of them represented a story, a life touched by the system she now sought to transform. She picked up her gavel, its weight familiar yet imbued with new meaning. For the first time in a long time, Yvonne felt something she thought she'd lost: faith in the power of justice. Not the flawed, broken system she had once served, but the kind of justice that could be rebuilt, piece by piece, until it truly served everyone. "This court is now in session," she said, her voice ringing out clear and strong. And as the proceedings began, she knew that her fight was only just beginning. Beneath the surface. The air was thick with anticipation as Yvonne Williams stepped into the meeting room of the Justice Alliance headquarters. The polished hardwood floors gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the walls were adorned with photos of civil rights leaders and community advocates. A projector flickered to life at the far end of the room, displaying an intricate flowchart of systemic failures that Yvonne and her team had been dissecting for weeks. The movement had gained traction rapidly. Donations poured in, volunteers signed up, and media outlets clamored for interviews. Yet, as the excitement grew, so did the pressure. The Justice Alliance wasn't just a reaction to what had happened to Yvonne, it was a battle cry against centuries of ingrained injustice. Yvonne stood at the head of the table, her presence commanding yet approachable. "We've made incredible progress," she began, her voice calm but resolute. "But this is where it gets harder. Public support is strong, but the opposition is already mobilizing." "More than mobilizing," said Marcus Taylor, a veteran civil rights lawyer and Yvonne's right-hand strategist. He adjusted his glasses and gestured to the chart behind him. "Several law enforcement unions are lobbying against the bills we're backing. They're framing it as an attack on the integrity of the police force." Yvonne nodded. "Integrity," she repeated, the word tinged with irony. "We're not attacking integrity. We're demanding it." The room hummed with agreement, but the challenges ahead loomed large. One of their primary goals was the passage of the Equal Accountability Act, a sweeping reform package that would mandate independent investigations of police misconduct, overhaul training protocols, and eliminate qualified immunity for officers. The bill was bold, ambitious, and controversial. "We need to get ahead of their narrative," said Angela Morales, a communications expert who had joined the team. "If we let them frame this as anti-police, we'll lose public support. We have to emphasize that this is about justice, not revenge." "Agreed," Yvonne said. "But we also need to address the deeper issue, why these systems resist change so fiercely. It's not just fear of reform, it's fear of accountability. They know the system is broken, but admitting that means admitting they've upheld it for years." Angela leaned forward, her pen tapping against her notepad. "So, what's the angle? How do we humanize this issue while keeping the focus on systemic change?" Yvonne's gaze swept the room. "We tell stories," she said. "Real stories. Not just mine, but the stories of every person who's been mistreated, ignored, or silenced by this system. We put faces to the statistics." Marcus interjected. "That's powerful, but it has to be balanced with data. Lawmakers won't act on emotion alone. They'll need hard evidence to back up their decisions." "I'll work with the data team," Angela said. "We can compile a report that highlights disparities in arrests, sentencing, and use of force, broken down by race and socioeconomic status. The numbers are undeniable." As the meeting continued, Yvonne's mind wandered briefly to the night of her own arrest. The cold metal of the handcuffs, the jeering disdain of the officer, the suffocating helplessness, it was all still vivid. But those memories no longer felt like chains, they were fuel. Behind closed doors. Later that evening, Yvonne met with a smaller group of allies in her office. Among them was Detective Ramirez, the officer who had taken over her case after the initial arrest. He had since become an unlikely ally, advocating for reform from within the police force. "This isn't going to be easy," Ramirez admitted, his voice low. "There are people in the department who see what you're doing as a direct attack. They won't come out and say it, but they're digging for anything they can use to discredit you. Yvonne leaned back in her chair, her expression unreadable. Let them dig, she said. I have nothing to hide. It's not just about you, Ramirez said. They're targeting the alliance too. Anonymous tips, audits, even threats. They're trying to intimidate you into backing off. Yvonne's jaw tightened, but her voice remained steady. If they think fear will stop us, they don't know who they're dealing with. Ramirez hesitated before speaking again. There's something else. I've been hearing rumors, officers who've crossed certain lines, cases that were quietly closed. If we dig too deep, we might find things they're desperate to keep buried. Then we dig, Yvonne said without hesitation. We can't fix this system if we're afraid of what we'll find. The personal cost. As the weeks wore on, Yvonne found herself juggling the demands of her judicial duties, the growing responsibilities of the Justice Alliance, and the scrutiny of the public eye. The weight of it all was immense, but what weighed on her most was the impact on her family. One evening, Yvonne returned home to find her teenage daughter, Maya, sitting on the couch with her arms crossed and a scowl on her face. Long day? Yvonne asked, dropping her briefcase by the door. Maya didn't respond immediately. When she did, her words were sharp. Why are you doing this, Mom? Yvonne paused, caught off guard. Doing what? This, Maya said, gesturing vaguely. The alliance, the speeches, the interviews. Why can't you just stop? Yvonne sat down beside her, choosing her words carefully. Because it's important. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else. Don't you think that's worth fighting for? But it's not just about you, Maya said, her voice cracking. It's about us too. Do you know how scared I was when you got arrested? Or how scared I am now, every time I see something about you on the news? What if someone tries to hurt you? Yvonne's heart ached at the sight of her daughter's tears. She reached out, but Maya pulled away. I'm sorry, Yvonne said softly. I didn't realize how much this was affecting you. But I need you to understand, I'm doing this for you too. For your future. Maya wiped her eyes. I just don't want to lose you. Yvonne wrapped her arms around her daughter, holding her tightly. You won't lose me, she promised. But I need you to trust me. Trust that I'm doing what's right. Uncovering the truth. The next major breakthrough came in the form of a whistleblower, a former officer who came forward with evidence of corruption within the police department. The files he provided detailed years of misconduct, cover-ups, and discriminatory practices. The Justice Alliance acted swiftly, filing lawsuits, demanding investigations, and releasing the evidence to the press. The revelations sent shockwaves through the community, sparking outrage and calls for immediate action. But the backlash was fierce. Protesters gathered outside Yvonne's home, some in support, others accusing her of vilifying law enforcement. The threats became more frequent, and security measures had to be increased. Through it all, Yvonne remained steadfast. She appeared at rallies, testified before legislative committees, and met with community leaders. Each step forward felt like a battle won, but the war was far from over. The turning point. One night, as Yvonne prepared for yet another early morning meeting, she received a call from Marcus. It's happening, he said, his voice brimming with excitement. The Equal Accountability Act is moving to a vote. And we have the numbers to push it through. Yvonne felt a surge of relief and pride. We're not done yet, she said, though a smile played on her lips. But this is a start. As she hung up the phone, Yvonne looked out her window at the city below. The fight had taken its toll on her, but it had also given her a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for a future where no one would have to endure what she had. And she wasn't done fighting yet. The weight of victory. The day of the vote arrived under a steel-gray sky, clouds swirling as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Yvonne Williams sat in the gallery of the state capitol, surrounded by her team, community leaders, and families who had lent their voices to the fight. Below, lawmakers debated the merits of the Equal Accountability Act. Though the floor was filled with chatter, Yvonne's focus was unwavering, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "This is it," Angela Morales whispered beside her. "Months of work, years of pain, it all comes down to this." Yvonne nodded but didn't speak. Words felt too fragile for the weight of the moment. The arguments on the floor were fierce. Proponents of the bill passionately argued that it was a necessary step toward justice and reform. Opponents, some visibly uncomfortable, painted the legislation as a destabilizing force that would sow distrust in law enforcement. Senator Karen Dupree, one of the bill's primary sponsors, stood to deliver her closing statement. Her voice was steady, but the intensity of her conviction rang clear. "This bill is not anti-police," she declared. "It is pro-justice. It is pro-accountability. And it is pro-people. We are not asking for perfection, we are demanding integrity. For too long, our communities have been told to endure injustice as though it were a necessary cost of safety. But today, we have the power to say, no more." The room erupted into applause from supporters, though Yvonne noted the icy stares from some lawmakers. When the vote was called, she felt her breath hitch in her throat. One by one, names were called, and the tally slowly grew. Yes, yes, no. Yes. Each word felt like a hammer strike, driving home the magnitude of what was at stake. A step forward. When the final vote was announced, 51 to 47 in favor of the Equal Accountability Act, the gallery erupted. Cheers mixed with tears as supporters embraced one another. Yvonne found herself enveloped in hugs, her body trembling with a mix of relief and exhilaration. "We did it," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "We actually did it." Yvonne managed a smile, though the enormity of the victory hadn't fully sunk in. This was what they had fought for, a tangible, undeniable step toward systemic change. But even in the midst of celebration, Yvonne's mind turned to the battles yet to come. Passing the bill was only the beginning. Implementation would be another uphill climb, and the resistance wouldn't disappear overnight. Still, for the first time in months, she allowed herself a moment to breathe. The backlash. The victory was met with an immediate and sharp backlash. Within hours, social media was ablaze with vitriol from opponents of the bill. Protesters gathered outside the Justice Alliance headquarters, waving signs and shouting accusations of betrayal. Some officers staged walkouts, claiming the bill undermined their ability to do their jobs. Yvonne knew this was coming, but the ferocity of the opposition still caught her off guard. The threats became more personal. Anonymous letters arrived at her office, some filled with slurs, others warning her to watch her back. Security around her family was tightened, and the once welcoming glow of her home felt more like a fortress under siege. During a press conference a few days later, Yvonne faced a barrage of questions. Reporters asked about everything from the backlash to the bill's implementation, some even implying that the reforms were too radical. "What do you say to those who believe this legislation unfairly targets police officers?" one journalist asked. Yvonne's response was measured but firm. "This legislation doesn't target individuals, it addresses systemic issues. Accountability isn't an attack, it's a cornerstone of justice. If we can't hold those in power responsible for their actions, we undermine the very foundation of democracy." Her words made headlines, but they also made her a bigger target. The cost of change. The strain began to show in Yvonne's personal life. Late nights at the Justice Alliance and constant vigilance over her family's safety left her exhausted. Her daughter, Maya, withdrew further, her resentment bubbling beneath the surface. One evening, Yvonne came home to find Maya sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the darkened street. "Couldn't sleep?" Yvonne asked, sitting down beside her. Maya shrugged. What's the point? Every time I close my eyes, I think about all the people who hate you now. Yvonne reached out to touch her daughter's shoulder, but Maya flinched. Do you ever think about us? Maya asked, her voice breaking. About how this affects me and Dad. Every single day, Yvonne said softly. I think about how hard this is for you. And I hate that my choices have put you in this position. But Maya, I also think about what happens if we do nothing. If we let the fear win. I'm doing this so you can live in a world that's better than the one I grew up in. But what if it's not worth it? Maya whispered. Yvonne's heart broke at the question, but she didn't have an answer. A glimmer of hope. Amid the chaos, there were moments of hope. The Equal Accountability Act sparked a wave of similar initiatives across the country. Cities and states began adopting reforms inspired by the legislation. Community groups formed alliances with law enforcement to foster dialogue and rebuild trust. One afternoon, Yvonne received an unexpected visitor at the Justice Alliance headquarters. Detective Ramirez walked in, a weary but determined look on his face. You were right, he said simply. Yvonne raised an eyebrow. About what? About accountability, Ramirez said. About the system needing to change. I've seen officers stepping up, trying to do better because of this bill. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Yvonne smiled, the weight on her shoulders feeling just a little lighter. The long road ahead. Months later, Yvonne stood before a packed auditorium, delivering the keynote speech at a national conference on justice reform. She spoke of the challenges and victories, of the personal toll and the collective gains. This fight isn't over, she said, her voice resonating with conviction. Change is slow, and resistance is fierce. But every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to the future we deserve. We can't let fear, anger, or exhaustion stop us. We have to keep pushing, keep fighting, for ourselves, for our communities, and for the generations yet to come. The audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous. For the first time in a long while, Yvonne felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but she knew she wasn't walking it alone. The fractured mirror. As the months passed, Yvonne Williams began to see her reflection differently, not just in mirrors but in the people who now called her a leader, a disruptor, and, to some, a villain. Success, it turned out, didn't come with relief but with more pressure, more decisions, and more lives that seemed to rest in her hands. Despite the victory of the Equal Accountability Act, the world didn't suddenly transform. In many ways, it splintered. Lines between allies and adversaries blurred, and what had once been a straightforward fight for justice became an intricate web of negotiations, compromises, and unintended consequences. Bridging the divide. One of the immediate challenges was bringing law enforcement agencies on board. Many departments begrudgingly began implementing the accountability measures, but the spirit of cooperation was sorely lacking. In some precincts, officers quit in protest, while others quietly resisted by performing their duties with minimal effort, a practice some called slow-walking reform. Yvonne found herself in meetings with police chiefs, union representatives, and community leaders almost every week. The discussions were often tense. One afternoon, she sat across from Chief Raymond Price, a grizzled veteran of the force who made no attempt to hide his disdain. You think you're helping, Price said, his voice a low growl, but you're creating chaos. My officers are scared to do their jobs. Morale is in the toilet. And for what? A few headlines about justice? Yvonne didn't flinch. Chief Price, this isn't about headlines. This is about rebuilding trust, trust your officers need if they're going to do their jobs effectively. Accountability isn't the enemy here, it's the foundation for better policing. Price leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. We'll see, he said finally, as if testing her resolve. After the meeting, Angela Morales pulled Yvonne aside. You've got the patience of a saint, she said, shaking her head. Not patience, Yvonne replied, her voice weary. Just no other choice. The community speaks. While Yvonne wrestled with law enforcement, the communities most affected by the Equal Accountability Act were experiencing a different kind of reckoning. For some, the reforms symbolized hope, a tangible acknowledgement of their pain. For others, the changes felt too little, too late. One evening, Yvonne attended a town hall meeting in a predominantly black neighborhood that had been the epicenter of protests. The room was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. A young woman stood up to speak, her voice trembling with emotion. "My brother was killed by the police 3 years ago," she said. "And nothing happened to the officer who did it. So, excuse me if I don't jump for joy over this bill. It won't bring my brother back." The room fell silent. Yvonne rose to respond, her heart heavy. "You're right," she said, her voice steady but tinged with sorrow. "This bill can't undo the past. It can't heal the wounds we carry. But it's a step toward making sure no other family has to go through what yours did. And I promise you, this fight isn't over. We're just getting started." The woman nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. It wasn't the kind of closure Yvonne wished she could give, but it was honest. A rift within. Even within the Justice Alliance, tensions began to surface. Some members felt the organization was becoming too focused on political negotiations, losing sight of its roots in grassroots activism. During a heated staff meeting, Marcus, one of Yvonne's oldest allies, voiced his concerns. "We started this movement to fight for the people," he said. "Now we're spending more time in conference rooms than in the streets. Are we still the Justice Alliance, or are we just another lobbying group?" Yvonne took a deep breath. "Marcus, I hear you. But the reality is, systemic change requires working within the system. If we don't stay at the table, the people we're fighting for will be left out entirely. That doesn't mean we abandon the streets, it means we fight on every front." The room fell quiet, the weight of her words sinking in. Marcus nodded reluctantly, but the tension lingered. A shattered moment. The backlash against Yvonne reached its peak when a high-profile case tested the very reforms she had fought for. A police officer was accused of excessive force during a routine traffic stop, and the new oversight board created by the Equal Accountability Act launched an immediate investigation. The evidence was damning. Body camera footage showed the officer using unnecessary violence, but the investigation dragged on, hampered by bureaucratic delays and legal challenges. Public outrage erupted, with protesters demanding swifter action and critics of the reforms pointing to the delays as proof of their ineffectiveness. Yvonne found herself in the crosshairs. During a live television interview, a reporter grilled her. "Ms. Williams, you championed this legislation as a solution to police misconduct. But here we are, months later, with no resolution to this case. Do you still believe the Equal Accountability Act is working?" Yvonne's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "Change takes time," she said. "This case shows that accountability is happening, even if it's not as fast as we'd like. The system isn't perfect, but it's better than it was before. And we'll keep pushing to make it better." Her answer didn't satisfy everyone, and she knew it. But it was the truth. A quiet resolve. Late one night, Yvonne sat alone in her office, the glow of her computer screen illuminating the darkened room. On her desk lay a stack of letters, some from supporters, others from critics. One letter caught her eye. It was handwritten on lined paper, the script shaky but legible. "Dear Ms. Williams," it began. "I lost my son to police violence 5 years ago. I didn't think I'd ever see the day when someone like you would stand up for families like mine. Thank you for giving us hope." Yvonne's eyes filled with tears. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a drawer with others like it, a reminder of why she kept fighting, even when the weight of the world felt unbearable. As she turned off the lights and prepared to head home, she glanced at her reflection in the window. The face staring back at her looked older, wearier, but there was something else there too, a quiet resolve that no amount of opposition could extinguish. The battle was far from over, but Yvonne knew she would keep pushing forward. For the grieving mothers, for the disillusioned officers, for her daughter Maya, and for herself. Because in the fractured mirror of justice, every shard was a piece worth fighting for.